Welcome back to Beyond Well Science. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and today I am absolutely thrilled to be talking with Robert Whitaker. He's an American journalist and author who has won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science, including the George Polk Award for Medical Writing and a National Association for Science Writers Award for Best Magazine Article. In 1998, he co-wrote a series on psychiatric research for the Boston Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. And his first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover magazine as one of the best science books of 2002. Anatomy of an Epidemic won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. As a fellow journalist, I have to say I'm a little gobsmacked just by being able to talk with you today, Robert.
Well, trust me, there's no reason to be gobsmacked. But I do love that word.
Yeah, me too. Words matter, especially when it comes to the lives of so many Americans who are diagnosed with a mental illness. And I want you just to take us back to the journey of your interest in this particular topic and why you felt like you had something to say about it.
Yeah, so I actually didn't have any particular interest in psychiatry when I was a reporter covering medicine, and I covered medicine for a newspaper. I also had my own publishing company briefly. I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School. My point is, I didn't come into this field with any particular interest or ideology or belief system. But really what happened was when I was doing this series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings, I came upon a study that just gobsmacked me. And here was a study. The World Health Organization had twice conducted longer-term studies that compared outcomes in 3 developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia, with outcomes for schizophrenia patients in the U.S. and 6 other, quote, developed countries. One was 2 years in length, one was 5 years in length. And each time, they found that outcomes in the developing countries, and specifically India and Nigeria, for people diagnosed with schizophrenia by Western doctors, those outcomes were much better in the poor countries. And in fact, the World Health Organization investigators concluded this: living in a developed country is a strong predictor you will have a poor outcome if you are diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I was astonished by that, because my understanding was, at this time, this is back in 1998, is we were making great progress in understanding the biology of schizophrenia. We now had drugs that, and we were coming to understand it was due to a chemical imbalance. We had drugs that fixed that chemical imbalance, like insulin for diabetes. That's what I was told by so many people. And yet here was this study saying outcomes are so poor here. And then I came upon a second study. And this was a study by Harvard researchers who had looked at outcomes for people so diagnosed over the past century, longer-term outcomes. And they concluded 2 things. Outcomes for schizophrenia patients were, in fact, getting worse. In other words, the recovery rates were getting worse. And they were now no better than they had been in the first 30 years of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1933. So what attracted to me was, in essence, a failure, and also data or outcomes data that challenged what I knew to be true. And what I knew to be true was we were making this great progress. So I wrote Mad in America really to investigate that failure. Why should living in a developed country with all our great medicine be a predictor that you'll have a poor outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia?
So, Robert, did your subsequent journalism show that to be true with other illnesses as well? Bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety?
Well, it's not so much that there are comparative outcomes for depression, bipolar, and anxiety that I've found. But what you do find is that, for example, depression today in our modern Prozac era runs a much more chronic course than it used to, even in our own country. So outcomes for depression actually are getting worse today. Anxiety, same thing. Anxiety used to be seen as, well, first of all, it used to be seen as something that was pretty prevalent.
Yeah.
Many people struggled with anxiety. But it, too, was seen as a temporary problem, not a chronic condition. Now it runs a more chronic course, and if it's treated with benzodiazepines long-term, you see all sorts of difficulties. And and bipolar disorder is really a phenomenon. So it used to be known as manic depressive disorder, used to be quite rare, and also seen seen as an episodic disorder, not a chronic disorder. Now you see some studies saying, well, it affects 1 in 50 people. In other words, it's moved from a rare disorder to a much more frequent disorder. It also runs a much more chronic course. People are much more likely to be disabled than they used to. By disabled, I mean on government disability. They're much more likely to be symptomatic 5, 10, 15 years after initial diagnosis. So the similarity is this, is you see the failure across diagnostic conditions. In other words, my own interest began with schizophrenia. There were the WHO studies showing this sort of societal failure. Then in a later book called Anatomy of an Epidemic, I really looked at across diagnoses. And what you see is basically mental disorders running a much more chronic course than they used to.
I know that people are going to hear this, especially people who claim that their lives have been saved because of their psychiatric medicine, and say, I wouldn't be here if not for my antidepressants, or I wouldn't, my child wouldn't be here if not for giving them mood disorder. How do you counter the number of Americans who really do feel as if this was a life-saving intervention to be able to get access to psychiatric meds?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing, when we talk about running a more chronic course today, we are, of course, talking about outcomes in the aggregate, all right? So let's say, and I'll use depression as an example. So in the pre-antidepressant era, you would see that about 85% of people who've been hospitalized for depression nevertheless would recover in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months and be discharged. And a large percentage of those wouldn't have another depressive disorder. Now, so in other words, you have and there's an NIMH study on this. That's a very good recovery rate. And actually, it's hard for an intervention like antidepressants to lead to a better long-term outcome because you were having, this 85% recovery rate. So we still get people who are depressed, go on drugs, and do well. But what happens is you see a much lower percentage actually doing well 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. So that's the first thing. When you hear that from people, the people who say that are generally the good responders to antidepressants.
Correct.
That's who you're hearing from. The other thing is this. So often when people assess their own, the importance of antidepressants in their own life, what they remember is that dark moment when they first went on antidepressants. So their memory, their baseline, or their own internal comparison is against that worst moment. And they may be better than that worst moment. But what they have no ability to see is, well, what would have happened if they had been treated with some other modality, a non-drug modality? Where would they be today? And that's when I say the sort of increasing chronification with medications is you actually see higher recovery rates, lower disability rates for those, on the whole, who find other modalities, for dealing with depression. There was even an NIMH study in the 1990s that looked at disability rates, for example, with people with depression. Those who decided to go on medication, it was like 6 times higher. And we had something similar out of Canada. And that's the type of data that at least needs to enter our sort of societal discussion about these.
And one of the most interesting things that your organization is doing now is looking at outcomes in Asia, Brazil, Spain, Finland, other countries that are doing much better in terms of both the treatment, the use of antipsychotics, and the long-term outcomes. And your interest in covering this revolution from this worldwide perspective fascinates me. Why do you think that we need to train that lens on this particular issue, Robert?
There's a couple reasons here. Just go back to that first study that we were talking about when the outcomes were better in India and Nigeria. So what could we learn from that? Well, one of the real stunning things in those studies was this. After the first study, the World Health Organization investigators hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is the patients there are more medication compliant. They're more willing to take their antipsychotics long term because we do know that many people so diagnosed don't like the drugs here in the United States and other Western countries. So they measured medication usage in the second study, And much to their surprise, they found that in those poor countries, in those developing countries, where the outcomes were much better, they used the drugs differently. They used them acutely for a period of time, but not chronically. In other words, they kept very few patients, low percentage of patients on the drugs continuously. So that at least raises a question about our own belief system, because our own belief system is that antipsychotics are absolutely critical for people so diagnosed with schizophrenia. Well, lo and behold, in 2008, we get our own long-term study on schizophrenia outcomes and outcomes for other psychotic disorders. It's done by Martin Harrow at the University of Illinois, and he follows a large group of people for 15 years. And what does he find and conclude, which few in our public have ever heard, is that outcomes, recovery rates, were 8 times higher for schizophrenia patients over the long term for those who had stopped taking antipsychotic medication. Their recovery rate was 40% versus 5% for those who continually took the drugs. So what you see, you asked me this question, why is it important to also follow what is happening in other countries, is because you can learn from them. I mean, here in the United States, we can learn from what they're doing. And the best example of this learning that is going on, in Finland, in northern Finland, they reassessed their use of antipsychotic drugs for psychotic patients beginning in the early 1990s. And what they really went to was a model that actually tried to avoid immediate use of drugs and then of antipsychotics, or if people didn't get better after, say, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever, they would then put them on antipsychotics for a period of time, low dose, and then see who could come off. In other words, they had developed a selective use model of, best use models of antipsychotic drugs. And they had by far the best outcomes in the Western world using medications in this way, and also adopting something called open dialogue therapies, which is a very intense form of family therapy, also just helping people develop new narratives for going forward, new hopes, that sort of thing.
I want to talk about some of the features that you have coming out that have been funded by your organization. And the one that really caught my attention was a work of Josh Kendall, a journalist who's working on an article about the ACE study. And many people are familiar with this. It's the implications for care for traumatized kids. And Josh reports that the lead investigator of ACE did not want psychiatry to get its hands on these kids. What is the background on that?
Well, the background on that, first, Josh is a very good reporter, and he's done a couple features for us. And this is what we're moving for as an organization, madinamerica.com, is doing our own reporting. So he spoke to the developer of the ACE study, and his understanding was, okay, you have kids that have been traumatized, you've been kids that have not been able to form bonds with parents, they haven't been able to feel safe, and what he really showed in his study was these early experiences, boy, they have long-term ramifications in terms of psychiatric health and physical health. And his fear was that if we turn these kids into psychiatric patients, we're going to pathologize them, we're going to give them drugs, and we're not going to spend the time and energy to build safe environments for them and to give them, the roads back to a greater sort of robust wellness and health. And, of course, his fears became true. What we do with traumatized children or children that are put into foster care is we pathologize them today.
Your team is also looking at some really in-depth studies that have been done by other psychiatrists that maybe weren't getting the attention they deserved. How are you combing through what type of research is being done and selecting which ones you're going to actually put out to your followers?
Yeah, this was an important part of madinamerica.com because one of the problems we have as a society is the research results. The journal publications that get promoted are ones, though, that sort of fit the common narrative, that can, help that actually do promote our use of drugs, that sort of thing. So we have a team led by Justin Carter. He's a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts in clinical psychology, and he heads up a team of about 10 people who have ways to comb through the journals, identify articles, often in very good journals that do, say, focus on long-term outcomes our focus on, efficacy measures of alternative non-drug modalities. And it's a way, and what they do is they go in, they look at these findings, and then they briefly recap the research, and it's a way to provide an outlet for the public to news that just generally isn't publicized. It's coming from good research journals. And what's really, I think, important, and we have we do this 5 days a week, so we have a new report every day of the week. And this not only helps inform the public, it actually helps inform the research community itself. So, for example, let's say you're interested in how are antidepressants affecting long-term outcomes. What are we finding? The only place I know that really carries that information is us. And there's been about 4 or 5 studies on this topic in the last, 4 years. Each finding was, in fact, problematic related to long-term outcomes, which is of such interest to prescribers, to anybody taking these drugs. And we're really the only media outlet that's covering this information.
You can go to madinamerica.com to look at some of these alternatives to mental health care as usual, the general feature articles, the investigative pieces, and these in-depth interviews, and also just the enormous impact it's going to have on our political process as we move forward. Robert, I'm so happy I was able to speak with you, if even just for a short time, and we'll be watching and trying to highlight some of the great work that comes out of this investigative journalism effort. Thanks again for being with us.
Sheila, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.